They just accumulate snow and accumulate snow. It's like at the end of the driveways, you can't see it on the road. Snowbanks are snowbanks are so huge, they're like 5 foot tall. They also gave me a sweet rental car. Yeah. You see, it's called a Chevy jar. Have you seen this thing? It looks like a PT Cruiser. looks like an SUV and a PT Cruiser faded. It's awful. It's like bright red. No. No, this is just what the New York City rental agency decided to give me.
No, you drove up.
Yeah, because I was staying. And also I hit up the Walmart. Oh yes, Portland. Oh, good. Got to.
You're not dead now. Already, Kirk is.
So is there a reason why I don't have this on the third floor? Is there?
Okay, maybe we should start. So this is Gavin's second or third talk? Second talk. So if you haven't given a talk or you haven't given a second talk, you should contact Bastian or myself and offer to give a talk. I know it won't be as exciting or as interesting as polar bears and Martha Stewart, but I'm sure some people will show up. So Gavin, tell us all about it.
Okay. As you know, I have a minor public presence, which has 2 main consequences. One is I get showered under every time there's some kind of blogospheric snowstorm going by that prevents me from doing any actual real work. So I'm not going to talk to you about any real science that I've done because I haven't done any science and I don't know how. Secondly, I do get occasionally invited to do something kind of interesting. So I'm going to talk to you about one of those little interesting things I was invited to do, and I'm going to tack on a little bit of science at the end, which I've just learned about, so you can benefit from my own information. So, I think it's, in any kind of environmental issue, it's inevitable that there's going to be a single species that gets picked out as being the icon for the impacts of ozone depletion, or climate change, or acid rain, or something like that. So the question for climate change, of course, is which one is it going to be? Will it be the mountain pine bark beetle and its maggots? Or okay, so we don't really need to discuss that very much more. Oh, by the way, all the photographs are ones that I took, so there's no stock photos. They're cute, it has to be said. So I was invited by a group called Polar Bear International to come up to Churchill, which is here, on the coast of Hudson Bay. This is Lake Superior, Ontario, Ottawa's down there somewhere, Winnipeg and Churchill. So this is pretty much it's not quite in the Arctic Circle, but it's very much Arctic environment. It's there's a lot of tundra around, not very many trees, and not very much else to do. Churchill exists because it's a deep water port, and there's a train which goes from Churchill through to Gillam, Thompson, Flin Flon, and then down to Winnipeg. There's no road to get there, so the only way to get there is either by train or by boat or by flying. But there's actually quite a large community. There's about 1,000 people that live there, mostly associated with the port, or Churchill's next claim to fame, which is that it's the polar bear capital of the world. So it is in fact the polar bear capital of the world. And so people go there to look at polar bears. So I was invited by Polar Bear International, which is an NGO that campaigns for polar bear conservation, habitat conservation, education, because they had organized with Martha Stewart of Martha Stewart fame, to come to Churchill to have a look at the polar bears and to do a story about polar bears, the environment, and the impacts of climate. So to give you an idea about why polar bears congregate in Churchill, this is a useful map. This is sea ice conditions around mid-November 1980, and so you can take this as kind of typical of the pre-anthropogenic era. And what you can see is that by the time you get down to November, the sea ice in Hudson Bay has kind of made its way all the way down. There's Churchill there. It's kind of made its way all the way down to the coast. Now, the key thing about polar bears is that they are absolutely sea ice creatures. They need the sea ice to be able to hunt seals. Seals are what they eat, and anything else is not even a feeble substitute. It's no substitute at all. And so what happens is that as the so during the winter time, Hudson Bay is completely frozen over in general, and there's quite a large population of bears that live on the ice over here. But as the sea ice disappears in the summer, they move to land, where they just sit around, wander around. They don't eat for months at a time, and then as the winter comes back on, they congregate on the coast, waiting for the sea ice to come back. And as soon as the sea ice comes back, they wander off onto the sea ice in order to find seals.
So they're not hibernating; they're just not eating.
They have a weird thing. It's kind of unique for polar bears, and it's different for grizzlies. But they just shut down all of their systems. They don't pee. They don't excrete. They don't use very much energy. They do use their fat reserves. So during this kind of fallow time, they lose about a pound of weight a day. So they start off at the end of the beginning of the summer, end of the spring, weighing. The big males can weigh, be 1,000 pounds. The big females maybe 600, 700 pounds, and they'll lose a pound a day until they start to feed again, hopefully in November or December. So work out how many days that is, and then see what a difference that makes. So they really do gather near this area. And so if you're in Churchill, it's like a fortress city, essentially. They have bear traps basically all the way around the city. They try and discourage bears from coming into town, obviously, though sometimes they do. And they really don't encourage people to walk on their own outside of the city limits, because if a bear sees you and it hasn't eaten for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months, you are dinner. Because of their really proactive stance on trying to keep the bears out of the city, nobody's actually been eaten in the city for about 35 years, but people are eaten outside the city. So I got there the first day. This is pretty much typical terrain. You've got a few trees. The trees, it's not warm enough for them to reproduce sexually, so these are all remnant tree clones that propagated up there, presumably the Holocene, the early Holocene, and are now just kind of like clinging to life in kind of clones. So this tree will all be the same tree, or just kind of propagate a few through. Anyway, so we went out, and one of the guys took us for a drive just a little bit down the coast, where there were some bears just hanging around. And at this point, we're sitting in a pickup truck, and the window is wound down, and the two of us in the car are going, oh, clickety clickety, oh, look at the thing. So I've got a whole sequence of bear kind of trampling slowly towards me. and this is a male. This is a hungry male. You can tell that it's quite hungry, because you can see all the flaps of skin. Like normally, when they're beginning of the spring, they're much more bulked up. So this is a bear that hasn't eaten for a while, and you can tell that he's been in trouble. There's a cut on his face there, and so this is as he's coming quite close at this point. So he's kind of there. At which point, the person who's sitting right next to the window starts trying to close the window while we're all trying to take. Okay, so now we're panicking a little bit because it's quite close, and I neglected, unfortunately, to keep filming during what subsequently occurred. But the next time when I was able to take a photograph, this is what happened. So, okay, so in between here and here, this bear jumped on the front of the pickup truck and started going, and the guy who's driving the pickup truck goes, oh, shit. So we're reversing thing, and then he kind of rolls off the front of the pickup truck, and then this is after he's kind of rolled off, and he's kind of got back up, and he's kind of looking at us. We're reversing quite a distance away at this point, and he's just giving us the evil eye and telling us not to mess with him anymore. So that was my introduction to the cuddly polar bear species. What happens when they come close into town is that they have bear traps all over the place. So they'll put seal meat in the back of the bear trap. These things are hungry. They go in. The door closes behind them. These are very, very solid steel things, and they take them to the polar bear jail. So the building behind here is the polar bear jail, which is a leftover surface building from when there was an army base here. And they just let them sit in the jail for, a few weeks so they can kind of calm down and sit around. You don't need to feed them because they're not expecting to eat at this point. And then after a few weeks, they airlift them somewhere else. So they have a helicopter service. This is, like I said, about a 700-pound bear, which they kind of tranquilize, put in a net, and then cart off and then dump on the other side of the Churchill River, where hopefully he will just hang out and not come back into town. What they used to have to do was that they would put them down if they came into town, because they would get too used to seeing how much food was available in town. You go through the garbage, you go through people's houses, and the houses are not built to withstand that kind of stuff, and so people were being hurt. But now they have a much better system. It doesn't appear to harm the bears in any way. They get tagged once they're released, and then they track those bears as part of the tagging and population monitoring that the Manitoba Conservation does, and they come back every year. And so there doesn't appear to be any harm in doing this, but it does get them out of people's way. So this is the terrain. You can just about see Hudson Bay over there. There's no ice at this point. There usually is, but there wasn't that year. And this is like one of these clumps of cloned fir trees. They're really scary. The wind is really pretty bad, and everything else.
When is this?
This is in this is the end of November. And everything else is a little bit of scrub. It wasn't very snowy, and that was unusual, but it was quite cold. It was about between -5, -10 most of the time. But it was a pretty big wind chill. And then what people do there is they go on trips on these tundra buggies. Give you a feeling. So this is a fully grown bear. This is about 1.5 meters. This is 3 meters above the ground. So the bear is thinking, oh, dinner in a can. But they can't jump up that high. And so you'll get them kind of coming up there, trying to be very curious. Most of the time, they just ignore these things because they're not accessible food. So you'll see bears just sitting around, just paying no attention to these.
Tilted?
Why is it tilted?
Or is that just their perspective?
Yeah, no, it's not tilted. It's just me with the camera not being quite accurate image. And so these buggies go out there. This is about 25 miles, 30 miles away from Churchill town, and it used to be the site of naval exercise yard or an army munitions base. So there were roads that were made in the tundra at that point, and these buggies just use those roads. So it's not that they're not messing up any tundra, but they are just using an old army base basically. And so people go on these trips. It takes you a couple of hours to get out there. You hang around and you go back. And you'd get some really good close-up photographs. So the other photograph I showed you was a bear that was pretty much doing that. And you know, if you've got a decent zoom lens, you can really get a good shot. There's a lot of frozen lakes out there. Basically, the bears just kind of sit, and they don't very much interact with themselves or with the other bears. There was about, I would say, maybe 50 to 100 bears in this area when we were there, and mostly they just kind of like sit around. You know, they just sit on a rock and stare at you, just kind of see what's going on, because they're just waiting. They're just waiting for the ice to form so that they can go out and hunt seals. These frozen lakes, they're frozen all the way down to the ground, so there's no sustenance in these lakes.
But why don't people feed them with this? The polar bear, they need fat. The seals, it's just the fat,
Yes.
what they eat. But why don't they give them fat? It's really easy to give them fat and they will be just happy and not annoy people.
Where are they going to get the fat from?
Yeah, just, you know, I don't know.
There's nothing here. Everything here has to be flown in or shipped in on the train. There's no excess fat that you can just go around and give it a turn. Yeah. So, but occasionally they do interact with each other, especially the young males. This is a relatively young male, and they'll kind of find the other young males and they'll kind of practice play fighting. These would be males that are a few years old, maybe 3 or 4 years old. They live in the wild about 18 years, but at this stage they're just kind of playing around. So they do a lot of play fighting, and you can see some pretty nice things like that. They also do a lot of kind of play den building, right? So they're not breeding at this point, right? The cubs that would have been born this season would be around 2 or 3 months old at this point. Or from last year, the mothers stay with the cubs for about 2 years. The dens are made in snowbanks or in holes on land, and they just kind of like sit there for a while, and then they come out in the winter with the cubs so they can go feed. So this is a young female bear, and she was kind of making a kind of den in the snowbank here. So she was kind of crawling in and like, you know, falling over, and it was great to see. It was a lot of fun. And she came out and kind of shook herself off. And this one was actually interesting because she then took a dump. And it's very unusual to see that at this time of year because they haven't eaten anything, right? So they have no fiber in their system. So there's no, you never see a polar bear turd. It's all just, you know. But she'd obviously eaten maybe from something that she found along the coast, moving north, and so showed us that. That was very.
I don't know other animals.
Are there no others? There are Arctic foxes, which are very cute if you see one. There are Arctic hares. There are birds, crows, fish in Hudson Bay. But in terms of, you know, land animals, you know, there's no caribou in here. Hudson Bay is not actually that close to the Arctic. I mean, we're about, you know, Bergen is further north. Okay, so
Question. Is there a native population there, and what did they subsist on?
So actually, Churchill is there is a small native proportion of the people that live there, but it's not a native community. It was built there because of an army base, because of an observatory, and because of the port. And so it's and now because of tourism. So it isn't really it's not a traditional place. There are traditional settlements further north, and they have an interesting relationship with the bear. They're very fond of conservation. They worry a lot about climate change, but the bears are there to be hunted, and they're there to provide food and warmth and fur. And so there are some pretty serious communications issues, if you like, between scientists and native populations when it comes to dealing with polar bear conservation. There's a lot of denial that there's any problem at all, and I will discuss why that will be in a little bit. So, what's the climate change angle? Well, I don't really need to explain this very much to you guys, but basically the Hudson Bay sea ice is melting earlier in the season and is freezing later. So this is the total amount of sea ice. So this is the summertime when there's no ice, and then this is the winter time when pretty much the entire Hudson Bay is frozen. So the anomaly at the moment for peak winter is 0 because Hudson Bay still freezes over, and the anomaly obviously when there's no ice is obviously. Excuse me.
That's a new one.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry?
I'm giving a talk here.
Hi. I have no idea how you managed to get me in this number because I'm in the middle of I'm actually doing a presentation. So if you could ask me to call, if you could call me back in maybe an hour or two, that would be better. I have no idea how it got to here then. Okay, bye.
How did you do that?
That was extremely strange. Okay. I'm being stalked. Yeah. So obviously, in the midwinter and in the midsummer, there's no anomaly in Hudson Bay, so in Hudson Bay sea ice. But you can see that in the tail regions. So this is the spring. This is the fall winter time. What's happened is that freeze up is being reduced by a month on one side and is retarded by a month on the other side. So the amount of time that there's ice in this region has reduced by about 2 or 3 months, only in the last 30 years. So that makes a big difference. I remember I said that the bears lose about 1 pound a day, and if you start off at 700 and you go for 6 months without eating, 6 times 30, 180. Yeah, and if you're not 700 pounds and you're only 400 pounds, or if you're a cub, okay, that's really, it starts to, as they say politely, increase mortality for the bears, particularly for the young cubs. Oh yeah, decreased survivability of cubs is what they say. So basically, the biggest cause of death of bears in this region is starvation. It's not trapping, it's not hunting, it's not being eaten by anything else, it's not falling off the ice, it's not drowning, it's starvation. You can have a sense again of the last 30 years what's been going on. This is in November. So November, the sea ice is kind of just in here, and what we're seeing is we're losing almost all of that sea ice in November. So in November there should be sea ice, there's not any. In December, the anomalies are all in the southern region where it used to be that it would have frozen up by the end of December, and now it's only kind of freezing halfway. So in this region, particularly, you're seeing a much longer retardation of the freeze update. The actual anomalies for November and December this year were really severe. It was the warmest summer that they've had there since records began. The warming at Churchill in the temperature records about 2 degrees over this period. And you can see that the anomalies persisted all the way through December. So you didn't have ice here, weeks and weeks past when it should have come due. So obviously there's a little bit of interannual variability that's going on there, but it does, I think, highlight some of the problems that we've got. This makes it a little bit clearer, I suppose. This is the situation in December 2nd, 1980. This is December 1st, 2010. In 1980, almost the entire Hudson Bay was already frozen over. In 2010, almost none of it was. So the polar bears are impacted by this in a very regional way. And I think it's very important when people talk about polar bears is to acknowledge that there are very different populations that have different issues and have different stresses. The population that we were looking at in Churchill is the Western Hudson Bay population. It used to be about 1,200 individuals, now down to about 700, 800 individuals. Southern Hudson Bay is another one that's quite well studied, because obviously these are places that are relatively easy to get to. Places that like the Churchill Sea and the Beaufort Sea populations, these are also ones that are suffering quite strongly, because these are the ones where the biggest changes in sea ice have occurred. Now, if you go to somewhere in here, like the McClintock Channel or the Gulf of Boothia, these are populations that are pretty stable, right? And this is the populations that a lot of the native population mostly interact with. In these regions, you know, the couple of weeks when there's a lot of open water and the Northwest Passage is open, right? That's historically interesting, but for a polar bear, you know, 3 weeks of open water really is not any kind of problem. And so these populations in the Canadian archipelago are pretty stable, and so there's still these populations are really not in trouble. The populations down here, in here, where we have data, and of course in the Barents Sea and Kara Sea, these are the populations that are in trouble. I'll give you a quick list which you can't really read, but where there's a red, so this is look at the middle column. Where it's red is where you've got a declining population. So that's in Baffin Bay, Churchill Sea, Davis Strait, Kara Basin, Lancaster Sound, Norwegian Bay, Southern Beaufort Sea, and Western Hudson Bay. Those are places where the polar bears are really already in trouble. And where you've got a very red thing in this last column is where the projections for sea ice change combined with the projections for polar bear ecosystem health are indicating that these populations are in serious trouble. So these areas here, so Baffin Bay, Davis Strait, Western Hudson Bay, those are the basis for the endangerment finding that U.S. Fish and Wildlife concluded for polar bears. They put them on the threatened species list. Now, there are places, for instance, the Gulf of Boothia, which I mentioned before, and the McClintock Channel, where the populations have actually increased, and that's mainly because of greater controls on hunting permits, but where there's not very much, there's no projections that say that those populations are going to be in trouble anytime soon as sea ice continues to decrease, because the Gulf of the Canadian archipelago is really going to be the last refuge for sea ice in the Arctic. And in fact, they're actually there's a plan that Stephanie Furman and others have been putting forward to actually declare that a wildlife refuge for precisely those regions. So there's been a lot of discussion. There was a lot of discussion in newspapers, I guess, a couple of months ago, on whether the polar bear should be moved from a threatened species to an endangered species. And the arguments that go on there are actually quite subtle, and really revolve around to what extent each of these regional populations counts as an independent thing. If all of the polar bears around Hudson Bay disappear, but there are still polar bears in the Canadian archipelago, does that mean that the species is threatened, or does that mean that, or is that totally okay, right? So a lot of the debate that's going on is to the extent to which a population that's regionally specific and that doesn't really mingle with the other populations, whether that can be considered endangered in and of itself, or whether you need to take into account the whole of the species. Right. Is there
any genetic difference between these populations? Any notable difference?
No. I mean, they're the same species. They can all breed and things, but they do have slight characteristics that are different. I don't know if anybody's really done a proper DNA survey that could say which population a particular bear is from. but they, they've been tagged, and they do wander quite large distances, but you don't get Hudson Bay bears mingling with Chukchi sea bears, right, on any kind of short time scale. So they are quite regionally specific. They go out, they come back, they go out, they come back, and they pretty much stick to their region. And so you get some pretty nice sunsets there. Now, so that's kind of pretty much the end, I think. Now, you want to know about Martha Stewart, right? Okay. So, a couple of things about Martha Stewart. She's a very professional woman, right? I mean, when we were filming, she wasn't a particularly warm person. She wasn't a politician type person who wants to be everybody's best friend. But when it came down to actually doing filming or doing stuff, she just went like straight into professional host mode. It was quite good to see, and she didn't mess about. She brought her own sheets, because there's only 2 hotels in this town, and they're not very good. So she brought her own sheets. She brought most of her own food. One of the mornings when we went out on one of the tundra buggies, she actually made us all sandwiches using some meats and fresh bread that she brought from New York. And that was very nice. She was a fan of the donuts of the local bakery. That was quite good. She was keen on that. But there was one night we were all out to dinner in one of the local restaurants, which they're just kind of normal restaurants, and everyone was so friendly and so nice. And they said, "Oh, well, what can we get you? We'll cook you anything you want." She said, "Oh, maybe like pasta." "Oh, yeah, we can do this." Do you have any mussels? "Yeah, mussel with a little bit of tomato sauce." "Oh, totally, yeah." So I don't know what she was thinking, eating mussels in the middle of the tundra. But anyway, so she orders this plate of spaghetti with mussels and tomato sauce, and she starts eating it. She asks her friend, "Oh, is this a little chewy?" He said, "Yeah," and she doesn't eat the whole thing. And they were all very crushed, because they were under so much trouble, and they were trying to be so nice, and she did it. What can you do? But she's an interesting person, and she travelled with her interior decorator, and with a photographer and a camera guy, and one kind of generic, organising type person. And they flew up on a private jet that was leased. It wasn't hers. It was quite nice. We went inside, very pretty, and certainly better than the coach class Air Canada flight that I was on. The Polar Bear International people were great, actually. They, of all the kind of NGO type people I've dealt with, they were both down to earth, interested in science, interested in their issue, but very interested in what the science was actually saying. I spent a lot of time consulting, not just with me on climate issues, but with polar bear scientists from both the US and from Canada. And there are a few people there from the Center of Biological Diversity, which is based in Joshua Tree, California, and they're the ones that have been suing the US authorities for the polar bear to be listed as a threatened and now as an endangered species. So both of those groups, if you want to find out any more about polar bears, or you want to find out any more about their campaigns, they're both good sources to look at. So do you want to see the actual the clip that ended up on the TV show? Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, let's see if this is going to be.
Took me 600 miles north of Winnipeg, Manitoba, to the remote town of Churchill, which has a population of just about 600 people. Tourists visit here.
No, it's like some.
Wonders
I tried to
Northern
type it out.
Lights and beluga whale migration. However, in the winter, polar bears migrate directly through this town on their way north to the Hudson Bay. This is one of the only places on Earth where humans can observe these magnificent animals up close, making it the polar bear capital of the world, and a place I just had to visit. Joined by my friends Kevin Sharkey and Scott Duncan, I was eager to learn more about polar bears and discover how global warming is affecting this threatened species. My informative journey began on a helicopter tour over Cape Churchill.
Now we're traveling south with our pilot Andrew. We'll go on the coast here. We need the ice to freeze here. It's late this year. Normally there would be a line not far, but 200 feet offshore.
The formation of Arctic sea ice is critical for polar bears. It is on this ice that they spend the winter hunting for ringed seals, the staple of a polar bear's diet. Ideally, the bears will spend 8 months feasting out on the ice to build up fat stores in order to survive on land during the warmer months.
So we just had a most incredible flight, and we saw many polar bears, all looking for frozen ice, and I hope that it just gets colder than it is. It's
That was
still
the
not
same bear I
frigid
showed.
here, and the water is not freezing, and that's the plight of the polar bear.
Over the past 10 to 15 years, scientists have seen the polar bear population of Churchill decline by over 20%.
Right now we're in Wapusk National Park. It is a preserve for the wildlife, and we're going to get up close and personal, hopefully with the polar bears, in this amazing tundra buggy.
These all-terrain vehicles have tires that are 5.5 feet tall and 3.5 feet wide to ensure successful navigation over very difficult trails. In these well-heated buggies, we can comfortably and safely observe and photograph the polar bears.
Well, the wind is howling, but the bear is just lying there basking in the sun.
The vehicles also have large observation decks.
Oh, here he is standing right here. He wants to climb up here in the tundra buggy.
To learn more about these magnificent creatures, I spoke with Dr. Stephen Amstrom, the senior scientist at Polar Bears International, an organization dedicated to the conservation of this species.
How many people belong to PBI?
Polar Bears International is almost entirely fallen.
And that's while we're waiting. What's happened to the seal population?
Oh, the seal population is also, there's a lot more seals, right? There's millions of seals. But they need the ice to den. And so if the ice is too thin, they normally kind of burrow in the ridges, and then they kind of make a hole there, which is what the polar bears find. But as the ice thins, there's not so much ridged ice, and so they're having problems. So a lot of them are birthing on the open ice, which is not good either for the elements or for their safety in respect to the polar bears. So for the polar scientists, you've kind of got two camps. You've got one camp that's kind of very keen on protecting the seals, and another camp that's kind of keen on protecting the polar bears. There's a little bit of a conflict of interest there. But they're generally okay. But for instance, Cecilia Bitts is working with the seal people on issues, because as the sea ice really decreases, those will be threatened populations. Right, let's try this again.
Your organization. So donations largely go to either research programs
That's
or
the
to
bear that
education
you saw being
programs
lifted.
that bring the word about threats to polar bears to the general public.
What are the 5 nations that have polar bears?
The United States, in Alaska, Canada, Denmark through Greenland, and Norway, and then of course Russia.
And there are no polar bears in the southern hemisphere.
That's right. When you see pictures of drawings of polar bears and penguins together, that's not real.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Now, polar bears, where do they come from?
Polar bears evolved from brown bears probably between 150 and 250,000 years ago. And when a group of brown bears realized that there was an empty niche out on the sea ice where they could go out and hunt for seals.
And then they gradually turned the whitish color that they are?
If you're hunting in a white environment, it probably is beneficial to be the same color as the environment.
The largest land predators on Earth, adult polar bears, measure 6 to 10 feet tall and can weigh up to 1,700 pounds. Their average lifespan is 15 to 18 years, and females give birth to their first litter at 5 or 6 years. Typically, 2 to 3 cubs are born at a time, but due to the lack of food available to mothers, scientists are now observing many single births. Breeding takes place from April to mid-June. In the fall, pregnant bears enter dens to deliver their cubs.
Yeah.
In a safe and warm environment.
Well, we're on the Deer River with Andrew Toma, our helicopter pilot, who has been given permission to take us here to a real bear den.
So this is an inactive bear den, being on the lee side here. Snow would come and basically drip.
Stress is about a t-shirt, and she looks freezing.
So the people that live there, they're a lot hardier than us. You know, this is bomb, relatively speaking. You know, it was winter time, but you know, they were thinking, yeah, it's nothing. I mean, you know, it can get down to -40, -50 then, and this was like -5. You know, so they're much more cavalier about it. But you know, and we were all kind of bundled up in our expensive coats.
Top of her. So her and her cubs would be underneath the snow. As they grow older, she would push them farther and farther into the snow until eventually she'll push them right out and they'll do their walk back to the coast.
The typical mortality rate is approximately 30%, but when sea ice breaks up early, the mortality rate can increase to 50%. To learn more about the sea ice, I spoke with Dr. Andrew DeRoche from Polar Bears International.
Why do the polar bears choose to come here for their feeding?
Sea ice will form just to the north of us sooner than anywhere else in the Hudson Bay system.
So all this rock that I see out here, is that covered with ice during the winter?
500 miles out, you'll have solid ice, and the bears will wander right out about that distance. It's 500 miles from here, looking for seals. The problem is we don't have any the ice forming yet. Some of these bears might spend almost 6 months on land.
That's good. And DeRoche he's great actually. If you want to know anything about polar bears, he's really a good guy to go with. He works at the University of Manitoba, and like a really nice guy. Another question while we.
Who are the tourists? Are they Americans, Canadians?
All sorts. You also get, this is a good place for seeing the Northern Lights as well. It's relatively accessible. So you get a lot of package tours. These are not cheap package tours. So like a tourist day on the buggy is along the lines of $400 a day. Plus you have to get there, and it's not a cheap flight because you know it's in the middle of nowhere. It's an interesting airport because there's no security whatsoever. So there's no TSA, there's no screening, there's no because they figure that if anybody's hardy enough to have got there, then they can't be bad people. No, it's all turboprops. Yeah, mostly from Winnipeg. I think it's pretty much either Winnipeg or the other kind of Arctic towns.
How long did it take you?
It took you all day to get there because you have to change like 3 times. But it's not actually that far, but it is. It's not necessarily very easy.
That's where we start to get really concerned about the health of this population.
Right, because they really need to eat. They live off their fat that they gain while they're eating seals. So how many seals does a healthy bear eat in the 6 or 7 months that they're on the ice?
If you're just the average bear, you're eating about 1 seal a week.
And we hear so much, 45 years, the bears will be really on their way to extinction.
You look at these wonderful animals, and they're so well adapted to living in this environment. We owe it to future generations to really address this question and deal with climate change in a meaningful way.
During the autumn months, Manitoba's migrating polar bears attract over 12,000 tourists to the tiny town of Churchill, outnumbering the residents more than 12 to 1. Visitors have the option of staying at hotels in town or choosing more unique accommodations in the Churchill Wildlife Management Area 2 hours away.
There is a little complex of tundra buggies over to our left, and that is the Tundra Buggy Lodge.
The lodge's 5 specialized modules include 2 sleeper cars, a lounge, and a dining unit. I'm sitting with John Gunter, who is the general manager of Frontiers North Adventures.
We've got this opportunity for our guests to wake up in the morning and look out their window and literally see a bear shaking its snow blanket off, right? And they come in and get a coffee and relax.
Bears?
No,
not bears. The guests. It's an amazing experience to watch these animals in their natural habitat. But when hungry bears wander into town searching for food while they wait for the ice to form, they create a safety issue for the residents. The Manitoba Wildlife Conservation created the Polar Bear Alert Program to capture these wayward polar bears and release them back into the wild. Several bears have been captured during the night, wandering about town, and I'm with Daryl Hedman, who is the Regional Wildlife Manager of the Manitoba Wildlife. This is an important part of the conservation of polar bears in this part of Canada, and we are going to see a polar bear that has recently been taken into captivity. Rather than being shot, this is a very good alternative.
Yes, Daryl, it seems like you have a bear.
Yeah, it's a big male.
He's eaten whatever was hanging there.
Yeah, there'll be seal meat there, and he's been processed. You can tell in your tank.
But you were recently in town, and you're back again, see? Repeat offender.
Yeah, yeah, so he'll go for a timeout.
The object is not to kill them.
That's the idea of the program. It really took off in the early 80s. Before that, the bear come to town, it was just shot. Now it'll go to the holding facility for the 30-day period.
Why don't you just take him now and put him into a net and carry him off by helicopter to another wild area?
The reason for that is he could be back again. You know, the ice has got to come in within 3 weeks, so it's not bad for him.
Then you'll put him out on the ice?
Then he goes out on the ice.
The polar bear holding facility is located in an old military warehouse a few miles outside of Churchill.
A bear is about to be taken by helicopter and re-released out into the tundra.
The sedated bear was taken about 45 miles to the north. Then Dr. Stephen Abstrup and scientists from Polar Bears International inserted an ear tag so they can track the polar bear for their continued studies.
Well, I've been watching this polar bear for a couple hours now here out in the tundra, waking up. So he's survived rather well out here, but this is an endangered species.
Polar bears are currently listed as a threatened species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, based principally on the expectation that in the future the habitat would be so diminished for polar bears that they would be endangered, which is the next level of status up.
How many polar bears actually exist here?
A recent study found that there were about 900 polar bears here, but that was down from about 1,200 just 25 years before. So this population is known to be declining because of the reduced availability of sea ice.
Well, he is becoming more and more aroused.
Yeah,
and he might be very hungry after his time in the town.
Perhaps it's time to go.
Okay.
After spending 2 days observing these beautiful animals, I needed to know what is being done to save them. Dr. Gavin Schmidt is a NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City.
So at this point they're saying,
look out, look like you're looking at something.
They're looking at how the clouds are changing, they're looking at how dust patterns are changing, they're keeping track of how much sea ice there is, how the sea ice has been going down, particularly in the summertime over the last 30 years.
Now, what was the warmest year on record?
It might be this year. Right now, we're running tied with 2005, which was also a very warm year. That decade has been by far the warmest decade that we've seen in the historical record.
And yet, people everywhere refuse to believe that there is global warming going on. And a species like the polar bear is really in dire straits.
For a species like the polar bear that is so dependent on the sea ice, big change in its extent, in its duration, are going to have really major effects on that ecosystem.
We're creating the problem as human beings.
Right.
The animals are not making the problem.
No, the animals are just victims.
We have to change, don't we?
We have to think about where our energy comes from. We have to move towards renewables. And people can do really simple things to weatherize their homes, to switch to energy-efficient appliances and light bulbs.
Well, Dr. Schmidt, it's great that you could come out. Very, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My adventure in the Canadian tundra allowed me to experience firsthand how devastating climate change can be. I will certainly try to do my part to help reverse global warming and preserve the environment that these extraordinary creatures need to survive.
So wait, did she pay you then?
No. I was brought up by Polar Bear International. Yeah, so we don't need to know how to make baked Alaska. that was the next segment on there. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. So if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to.
I feel less worried about polar bears now if you point out that it's only really a few populations that are worried about what I worried about polar bears.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really tricky issue. I mean, if you, take bison. There's one little thing of bison left, and the entire population's vanished. Is that a good thing?
Why don't polar bears migrate to some places that there is plenty of sea ice?
Well, I mean, there may be some movement. Okay, well, you can't just take 1,000 bears and put them in a new environment.
I guess not.
Right, because then there are territories. The amount of polar bears in any particular region is probably quite close to what it could sustain.
Maybe not
So,
Americans. I'm sure some populations are growing.
Maybe they
well, that's because of the hunting ban, mainly in the 1960s. So, there could be some scope for population transfers, but given, if you look at the sea ice projections, it's not just this one, now, then it'll be the next one, and then it'll be the next one, and then you end up, the Canadian archipelago can't sustain 25,000 bears. Right? They can sustain a couple of thousand bears.
And what's the difference between threatened and endangered for Canada? Because this is all in Canada. They're
Right,
talking about
okay.
the U.S. policies, so they're
Right.
talking about
This
Alaska.
Is,
as far as we're concerned, right?
Right. So this
What
is
are
a,
the
this is
Canadians?
this is a real issue.
Yeah.
So in Canada, they're not listed at all. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is that that Nunavut and the Northwest Territories don't want to have them listed because they're a cultural. It's a very cultural issue for them, and so and in Canada, like here we have like one kind of skeptic person. In Canada, there's one skeptic person on polar bears who is, the Inuit lobby. There's not really an Inuit lobby, but who gets a lot of play in Canada. A guy called Mitch Taylor, who, according to Andy Durocher, who you saw over there, is completely fucking insane. We're talking batshit, to the point where he's pulled guns on other scientists who he's having an argument with. Okay, so this guy is like, woo, way out there. So they don't have a listing at all, which is for the conservationists is a real issue because you saw most of the bears in North America are in Canadian waters, not in US waters.
In Alaska, they have exceptions for endangered species for like whale hunting and seal hunting. I wonder if they could do something similar.
Yeah, so right now all hunting is done by permit, which it didn't used to be. So now, if you want to hunt a bear, and it's mostly Americans who want to hunt bears, you pay something like $45,000 to get a permit that had been issued to one of the native populations, and they'll take you up there and shoot a bear and come back. But not in Western Hudson Bay. This would be more in kind of Inuit and other parts of Nunavut.
But I guess there are also issues with Canada. If they list polar bears, then maybe the native population should not have a legal right to hunt them.
Well, that's one of the main points of contention. The other main point of contention is, of course, if you're drilling for oil and gas in polar bear habitats, you know, there's an extra hurdle that you might have to go through in order to get a permit if that might have an impact on the bears. I don't know if that's really the case or whether there has been any real impact from that yet, but that's another reason why the Canadians have not been very keen on doing this.
You mentioned about 25,000 bears worldwide. I mean, roughly at what point do they feel like there are issues with genetic diversity? You know, how low is the population yet?
That's a good question. I have no idea.
What is the impact of more short drilling on bear population?
I have no idea. Until somebody who knew something. I'm just the guy. I'm not. She said, "So tell me about all your research on polar bears." And so well, why are you here? I don't understand.
Have you heard anything whether there's any interbreeding between polar bears and brown bears?
People are fascinated by this question, and so the answer is yes. People have shot hybrid bears that had grizzly fathers and polar bear mothers. So, you know, maybe we don't want to investigate too closely the nature of that relationship. But nobody has any statistics on whether that's a common thing, whether it's more common now, because the grizzlies are moving north. So, you know, you might think that there's more possibility for population overlap than there would have been a few years ago, but nobody has any statistics on this, and so you can't tell whether this is something that's always happened or whether it's something that's happening now, especially.
Do you know if when the children that give birth, they can reproduce further?
If they're interesting. I don't know if I don't think anybody's ever seen that happen, but I don't know if that explains it. Can't happen. So, you know, I mean, one scenario might well be that the brown bear and grizzly bear populations kind of merge, and you lose the fact that there was a unique bear species that just lived on the ice. But, you know, Andy, you'd be happy with it. but you have to. I mean, I find it quite tricky to think about the health of a species as separately from the health of actual individuals. When people say, "Oh, the species are going to merge," or they're all going to move north. Okay, well, that's not actually what happens. What happens is that the cubs that are born in the south die, and the cubs that are born in the north live, and so you have a net transfer of population. But it's because the ones that are living in situations that are becoming more stressful don't make it, and they live less long, and they have more stress, and they have other things going on. So, you know, it's these things are tricky to think about.
But the whole extinction classification story, is this in somehow linked to greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, well, the basis of the well, so right now they're listed as threatened, right, which is one step down from endangered. Okay, so threatened is, given current trends, they look like they're heading to be endangered. So, which I think is, like, for the population as a whole, I think is the appropriate thing. For subpopulations, I think you could make an argument that they're already endangered. But that basis, the endangerment finding, is based on projections of sea ice change in the next 30, 40, 50 years, and all that's being driven by greenhouse gases.
Yeah, but do they try to get policies depending on the status of, you know?
Well, interestingly enough, when Fish and Wildlife listed the polar bear, there's a whole bunch of things that you have to do if there's a threatened species. You know, there's all sorts of things that need to change. But they put in an exemption that said, we'll do all that we can up to, but not including any changes to energy policy that might affect the level of greenhouse gases. So basically they listed it and said, well, you know, we're not going to do anything because of that.
are they affected by temperature itself? Like, are they disturbed by the fact that it's getting warmer, or is that not relevant?
Interesting question. I don't know. I mean, they are extremely well insulated. They have 2 layers of fur. The fur is very, very thick. Lots of layers of fat. It's yeah. I don't know. A couple of degrees here or there probably aren't going to make a difference, because they're perfectly happy going into the water, which is -1, -2 degrees, and coming back out and then sitting in -40-degree air and then back in the water, and so. A degree or 2 in the air is probably not going to be what's directly affecting them.
And in the worst, if you think of it, if they get thinner because they have no food, then a bit warmer is fine for them. Since they have less fat.
Do you hear any stories about bears not making it back? I mean, it seems to me waiting for ice is starvation risk, but if you're 500 miles out at sea, I guess you would see it. You might not see the recession line coming at you by the time you get to the edge.
Well, so they are pretty good swimmers. They can swim on a regular basis. They can swim 50 kilometers, 60 kilometers, 100 kilometers. Exceptionally, they've been tracked going further. But polar bears do drown because they're swimming and they're too far away from shore and they don't find anything. But that's obviously harder to track because you don't generally see the bodies or anything like that. So yeah, I mean there is a mortality. It's about 5% in the wild where they go and they don't come back. You don't know what happens.
So are there geoengineering plans to floating like platforms?
That came up as well for some reason. Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. but the issue is not so. Somebody said, oh, well, you just cover it with white plastic, but the thing is, white plastic is not somewhere where the seals are going to come and stick their heads through so they can breathe. You need to be able to break through. I mean, like what their design, the polar bears, their niche is seeing a seal kind of coming up through the ice, which can be, maybe a meter below you, right? And then just go bang and grabbing it. And you're not going to find some plastic substitute that's going to allow them to do that.
But they really break a meter of ice like that?
No, there's a breathing hole.
Okay.
But
okay.
But it's not. But they can break through quite. I mean, these things are fucking huge. I mean, like like the size of the bear would have been like kind of from here to there, and they weigh 700 pounds. You don't. They can hurt. They can make a big hole. Okay, well, good.
Thank you.